The Carter family home sat at the edge of Maplewood, a quiet suburban neighborhood where the lawns were neatly trimmed and the sidewalks almost always empty. David Carter, the father, was a mild-mannered accountant, meticulous and patient, the kind of man who believed in rules and routine. His wife, Claire, was a high school teacher, warm and nurturing, always tending to her husband and two children, Lily and Ethan. Their life was ordinary but comfortable, the kind of normalcy that lulled neighbors into a false sense of security. That Monday morning, the house buzzed with its usual rhythms. Claire made pancakes while Lily, aged 12, tried to negotiate a late bedtime, and Ethan, 7, dragged his socks across the polished kitchen floor, giggling. David checked his briefcase, making sure his pens were aligned and his schedules noted. He kissed his family at the door, waved goodbye, and drove off to work, the streets of Maplewood filled with the soft hum of traffic and birdsong. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary, yet there were subtle hints that not all was as it should be. Small things, easy to dismiss. The kitchen clock that ticked irregularly, the faucet dripping even after being shut tight, and a faint smell of iron in the air that Claire thought was from the old pipes. David didn't notice these. He never did. The children, preoccupied with their own antics, didn't notice either. In the office, David's day was the usual rhythm of numbers and papers, but a feeling of unease began to build in his chest. A colleague waved at him with a half-smile, and for a brief second, David imagined the colleague's face melting, the smile stretching into something unnatural. He shook the thought away, attributing it to lack of sleep. Still, when he returned home that evening, he noticed a faint smell again, metallic, coppery, and the locks on the door seemed slightly out of alignment. By Wednesday, the normal rhythms of their life began to fray. Ethan complained about a shadow that seemed to follow him in his room. Lily said she heard footsteps in the hallway when no one was there. Claire attributed it to imagination, the kind children conjure when tired or anxious. David brushed off his own unease, convincing himself that these were coincidences, minor oddities in an otherwise normal life. The neighborhood itself was quiet, almost too quiet. Dogs didn't bark at passing joggers. Leaves rustled in unnatural patterns in the evening wind. Lights flickered on neighboring houses even when no one was home. The Carters didn't notice, or perhaps they didn't want to notice. The subtle strangeness was easy to dismiss, like shadows on the corner of the eye. Frightening, but fleeting. Yet David could not shake the sense of being watched. Driving home from work on Thursday, he glimpsed a figure standing at the edge of Maplewood Park, shrouded in shadows. The figure didn't move, didn't shift, just stared at him as he passed. He rubbed his eyes, and when he looked again, the park was empty. Still, the sense of being observed clung to him, a persistent whisper at the back of his mind. That night, the Carter house seemed to sigh with the weight of expectation. Lights glowed softly in the living room, where Claire read to Lily and Ethan before bed. The children's laughter echoed briefly, but then, just for a second, it faltered, replaced by an eerie silence. David lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the hair on his arms prickle. Something was not right, he thought, but he couldn't name it. Unsettling coincidences began to pile up. A window that had been closed was slightly ajar. A family photo hung crookedly on the wall, though no one had touched it. Small items disappeared and reappeared in different places, and David found himself checking locks, doors, and cabinets repeatedly, as if the house itself had become unpredictable. Claire noticed the tension too, though she attributed it to David's work stress. "Maybe you just need a vacation," she said one evening, tucking a loose strand of hair behind his ear. David nodded, forcing a smile, though a chill ran down his spine. The feeling of being watched persisted, though he could not articulate it without sounding paranoid. By Friday, the unease became almost tangible. The children complained of shadows in their rooms again. The smell of iron, metallic, sharp, was stronger, more invasive, curling in corners and behind doors. David could no longer ignore it. He moved through the house with heightened awareness, checking every lock, every cabinet, every closet. Each creak of the floorboards made him flinch. Every gust of wind brushing the curtains seemed like a warning. Despite these signs, life carried on with a fragile normalcy. Dinner was eaten, homework done, baths taken, and the bedtime routine performed almost mechanically. Yet as David lay in bed, listening to the subtle creaks and whispers of the house, he realized that something was coming. Something patient, something waiting, something that could pierce the ordinary, seemingly safe world he had built. The normal world, the comfortable life he had always cherished, was poised on the edge of collapse. And soon, the darkness waiting outside the thin walls of their suburban sanctuary would force its way in. Saturday morning arrived, but the Carter household was already subtly off. The usual morning chatter between Claire and the children was quieter, strained, as though the air itself had thickened overnight. David awoke to the smell of iron, sharp and metallic, clinging to the edges of the house. It wasn't new. It had been there before, but now it seemed pervasive, almost deliberate. The children's complaints grew. Lily said she had seen a man standing at the end of the hallway late at night, watching her sleep. Ethan whispered of shadows that seemed to move independently, stretching unnaturally along the walls. Claire tried to soothe them, attributing it to overactive imaginations or the new horror storybook Lily had brought home. But her own unease was creeping in. She found herself checking closets and under the bed, feeling the tiny hairs on her arms rise as if the house itself were watching. David dismissed these incidents at first. He rationalized the shadows as tricks of the morning light and the iron smell as a plumbing issue. But by late afternoon, the disturbances became impossible to ignore. Doors that had been locked were now slightly ajar. Objects moved subtly, books on shelves shifted, a chair tilted, a picture frame on the wall crooked. The changes were almost imperceptible, but David felt their weight in his chest like a growing pulse of fear. Driving to the grocery store, David glimpsed a figure again. A man, standing near a lamppost on the corner of Maplewood and 8th Street, watching him with an unnatural stillness. The figure didn't blink, didn't move, and as David drove past, the man seemed to vanish, leaving only the lingering sense of being observed. David's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. His rational mind whispered explanations. A trick of the light, a passerby freezing in position. But deep down, he could feel the chill of something malevolent, patient, and unseen. By evening, the house had grown colder, shadows clinging to corners, stretching unnaturally along the walls. The faint metallic smell intensified. Claire felt a prickle along the back of her neck and insisted the children stay together in the living room. David paced. Every creak and groan of the floorboards heightened, as though the house itself were breathing. That night, the first real intrusion occurred. While the family slept, the front door, locked and checked multiple times, opened without a sound. A presence entered the home, silent and deliberate. Shadows pooled in the hallway, coalescing into a shape just outside the children's bedroom. Ethan woke to the sound of quiet breathing, frozen in his bed, unable to move. Lily whispered to him to stay calm, but her voice trembled. David was awakened by the faint sound of movement, his heart pounding. He crept toward the children's room. The shadows in the hallway seemed to stretch and twist toward him, unnervingly deliberate, almost sentient. He flicked on the lights. Nothing. A chill settled in his bones. He noticed a smear of something dark along the hallway wall, the metallic smell now overpowering, tangling with the fear curling inside him. Claire woke to David shaking her shoulder. "Something's here," he whispered, voice tight with panic. "Someone or something." They checked the doors and windows. All were locked, but the sense of presence lingered, thick and suffocating. The children clung to their parents, whispering of figures in the corners, shadows watching them. David felt a deep, gnawing fear settle in his gut. This wasn't just a break-in. Whoever, or whatever, had entered their lives was patient, methodical, and unnervingly silent. Over the next hours, small, inexplicable events escalated. Lights flickered without cause. The smell of iron bled through the house. Objects moved subtly, chairs shifted, toys rearranged, personal items disappeared only to reappear elsewhere. The family tried to rationalize it, blaming stress, exhaustion, or coincidences, but each rationalization failed to quell the growing terror. By midnight, the atmosphere of the house had changed entirely. The shadows thickened, curling in corners and along the ceiling. The metallic smell lingered as a constant reminder of danger. David heard it, a low, almost imperceptible whispering, like 100 voices just out of comprehension, repeating fragments of words. We watch, we wait, we know. The family huddled together in the living room, lights on, the children trembling, Claire clutching a kitchen knife defensively. David's own hand shook as he realized the impossibility of their situation. They were trapped, not by walls or locks, but by something unseen, patient, and intelligent. The night stretched endlessly. Every sound, a floorboard creak, a faucet drip, a wind gust, was amplified in their minds. Shadows moved unnaturally, reflecting shapes just beyond comprehension. The metallic smell thickened to the point of nausea, a persistent reminder of violence and death. And then David saw it, a figure, pale and impossibly thin, standing at the edge of the hallway, watching. Its presence radiated a quiet menace. The children screamed silently, too afraid to speak. Claire clutched David's arm as he tried to approach, but the figure did not move. It simply waited, patient, calculating, a predator observing its prey. By the end of the night, the family's nerves were shredded. Sleep was impossible. The house had become a psychological prison. The figure was still there, unseen by most rational eyes, but felt in every shadow, every movement, every metallic tang in the air. David realized the truth. Whatever this was, it wasn't random. It had targeted them, studied them, and now had infiltrated the very walls of their home and the corners of their minds. Their ordinary life, the normalcy of the Carter family, had been shattered. The disturbance was complete. The stage was set for what was coming. Whatever entered their home was patient, deliberate, and deadly. It had been watching, learning, and waiting for the right moment to strike. And by morning, the Carter family would know that nothing, not locks, walls, or routines, could keep the darkness out. By Saturday night, the Carter household had transformed. The familiar warmth of home was gone, replaced by a suffocating tension that clung to every wall, every corner. Shadows pulsed unnaturally along ceilings and floors, stretching and curling with a deliberate intent. The metallic smell of iron had thickened into a choking presence, and the whispering voices had grown louder, forming fragmented words. We know, we wait tonight. David paced in the living room, clutching a baseball bat he had grabbed from the garage. Claire sat close to the children, her hands trembling as she held the kitchen knife defensively. Ethan and Lily huddled together, eyes wide, unable to comprehend the suffocating fear filling the house. Then it appeared. The figure emerged from the hallway shadows, pale and possibly thin, its movements unnaturally precise. Its face was vaguely human, but twisted, features stretched and blurred like wet clay. The air around it pulsed with cold, an invisible weight pressing down on David and his family. What are you? David demanded, voice shaking. The figure's lips twisted into a smile that was wrong. Too wide, too sharp, too patient. I am everything you fear, it whispered, voice a rasping echo of multiple tones. And I have waited for you. The children screamed, but the sound seemed swallowed by the oppressive shadows. Claire stood, knife raised, shaking. Stay back, she yelled. But the creature didn't move in a conventional way. It dissolved into a writhing mass of shadows, coalescing in multiple corners simultaneously. Its presence was everywhere, yet nowhere. David swung the bat, but it passed through empty air, meeting no resistance. Panic gripped the family. The house seemed alive, groaning and twisting. Floorboards buckled, walls pulsed, and doors slammed shut with a deafening finality. The metallic smell reached its peak, sharp and nauseating, as if blood had pooled unseen in the corners. David's mind raced. He realized the figure wasn't just a physical threat. It was a predator that fed on fear, that manipulated perception. The shadows weren't simply dark, they were extensions of the entity, tools to isolate and terrify. Every distorted reflection, every whispered threat was a calculated attack on their minds. Claire clutched her children tightly. We have to stay together, she said, voice quivering. Don't let it separate us. David nodded. He tried to ground himself. Remember, he said, it can't touch what we know is real. Our love, our family, that's our shield. The entity seemed to sense his determination. The shadows surged, curling around them, pressing in with crushing weight. The whispers became coherent, taunting. "You cannot save them. You cannot hold them soon. Lily screamed. A shadow hand shot from the corner of the room, brushing her shoulder. She stumbled, frozen with terror. David lunged, swinging the bat at the nearest shadow, and it dissipated like smoke. But for every one he struck down, 3 more seemed to rise. Claire screamed at him to run. "David, we can't fight this." He shook his head. "We have to try." The entity coalesced into a single, horrifying form in the center of the living room. Its face mirrored Claire's, twisted into a grotesque mask, eyes hollow and endless. "She is mine," it hissed. "She belongs to me." David realized with a sinking horror that it had studied them, learned their routines, their bonds, and was now imitating them to break their spirits. The entity was patient, calculating, and cruel beyond imagination. A decision pressed upon him. He could flee, possibly leaving his family behind to an unknown fate, or he could confront it, risking everything to protect them. David's hands tightened on the bat. He could feel the sweat running down his back, his heart hammering. "This ends now," he shouted. He charged at the entity, swinging with all his strength. Shadows screamed and writhed, striking back with invisible force. But David focused on the center, the core of the horror, the twisted face mimicking Claire. With one final swing, the bat connected, and the entity shuddered, dissolving into darkness that retreated into the corners of the room. The oppressive weight lifted slightly. The whispers faded, leaving only the echo of David's labored breathing. The family collapsed to the floor, trembling, exhausted, and terrified. The shadows receded, but the metallic scent lingered, a reminder of what had almost consumed them. David hugged Claire and the children tightly. They were alive, but the house would never be the same. The entity had marked them, left an imprint of fear that would not be easily erased. As dawn broke, the house was quiet. The shadows were gone, replaced by the first light of morning filtering through the windows. But David knew the truth. The threat had not been defeated. It had been delayed, patient, watching, and ready to return when the family's fear weakened. The confrontation had ended, but the horror remained, not in the walls, not in the shadows, but in their minds. The entity had revealed the fragility of their perception, the vulnerability of trust, and the cost of underestimating what they could not see. David looked at his family, their faces pale and terrified, and understood that survival required constant vigilance, courage, and the unbreakable bond of love. The entity could mimic, manipulate, and terrify, but it could not destroy the reality they held together in their hearts. For now, they had won. But the true lesson was clear. Darkness was patient, and even when it retreated, its presence lingered, waiting for the next opportunity to strike. The first light of Sunday morning filtered weakly through the curtains, casting a pale glow over the Carter house. Everything seemed still, too still. The oppressive shadows from the night before had receded, but their absence was not comforting. The metallic tang of iron still lingered faintly in the air, an invisible reminder of the terror that had nearly claimed them. David sat on the edge of the couch, head in his hands. Claire and the children huddled nearby, trembling, exhausted, their faces pale. Words failed them. Silence carried the weight of the night's events more heavily than any description could. The house seemed almost ordinary again, but David noticed the subtle distortions immediately. A chair slightly misaligned, a photo frame tilted, the pattern of shadows along the walls, just a fraction off. The entity had left a mark, a subtle reminder that nothing within these walls would ever feel entirely safe again. Over the following days, the family tried to return to normal life. They ate breakfast, took showers, went outside, and attempted conversations as if the previous night had been a bad dream. But the echoes of the shadows lingered. Every creak, every gust of wind, every flicker of light triggered a memory of the figure that had stalked them, of the metallic smell that had invaded their lungs, of the whispers that had clawed at their minds. Claire noticed that Lily was more withdrawn than usual, glancing constantly over her shoulder. Ethan started speaking less, clutching a small toy to his chest as if it were a shield. David himself could barely focus at work. Numbers blurred on spreadsheets, emails felt meaningless. The normal rhythms of life had been permanently altered. Even at night, sleep eluded them. Every dark corner, every mirror, every reflection became suspect. The entity might have retreated, but David knew it was still there, patient, observing, waiting for fear to weaken their resolve. He checked locks obsessively, kept lights on for hours, and whispered reassurances to his family. But the underlying dread never fully dissipated. One evening, as David entered the living room after work, he noticed a shadow flicker near the window. It moved unnaturally, dissolving when he focused on it. His heart clenched. The entity had returned, not fully, but enough to remind them that the night's horror had not ended. He called the family together. "Listen," he said, voice tight. "We survived, but we have to understand the rules now. It feeds on fear, on doubt, on division. If we stay together, if we hold on to what's real, it cannot take us completely." Claire nodded, wrapping an arm around the children. "We'll face this together," she whispered. But even as they clung to each other, subtle hints of unease persisted. The metallic smell sometimes returned, faint but unmistakable. Objects occasionally shifted from where they were placed. And the faint whispers, just at the edge of hearing, echoed through the house during the quietest moments. Weeks turned into months, and the family learned to live with the tension, to recognize and ignore the tricks of the entity. They became hyper-aware of shadows, reflections, and noises. The terror was no longer constant, but its memory lingered, a permanent scar etched into their perception of home and safety. David understood something crucial. Survival was not about defeating the entity outright. It was about resilience, vigilance, and the bonds that could anchor them to reality. Love, trust, and shared memory became their shield against the darkness. Every act of normalcy, breakfast together, bedtime stories, laughter, was an act of defiance. Yet, the entity's patience remained the most terrifying aspect. It did not strike recklessly, it waited. It could return at any time, exploiting fear, exploiting doubt. David accepted this as a constant, unspoken truth. They were survivors, but survivors in a world where danger was patient, intelligent, and unseen. One evening, David found Lily staring at a corner of her room. "I saw him," she whispered, voice trembling. "He was just standing there waiting." David knelt beside her, holding her hands. "He's only shadows, Lily. Only fear. We are stronger than that. Remember that." The girl nodded, but he could see in her eyes that some part of the terror had been internalized, permanent. He realized that surviving the confrontation had left them marked, not physically, but psychologically. The lesson was grim but vital. True horror lies not only in death or violence, but in the lingering, invisible scars it leaves on the mind. Fear can invade, twist, and manipulate perception, but courage, unity, and memory can resist it. In the months that followed, the Carters adapted. They laughed again, played games, shared meals, and cautiously reclaimed their sense of normalcy. Yet the metallic tang in the air, the occasional flicker of shadows, the whispering voices, always faint, always at the edge, reminded them that the entity remained. And in the quietest moments, when no one else was watching, David would glance at the hallway, imagining the pale, twisted figure lurking just out of sight, patient and waiting. But he would also glance at his family, alive, together, connected, and feel a fragile, defiant strength. They had survived. They had endured. And even if darkness returned, they would face it together. The house was still, almost peaceful, but David knew the truth. Horror does not always end with climax. It lingers, shaping reality, testing courage, and demanding vigilance. The true lesson of that night was not just survival. It was understanding that resilience, love, and unity are the shields that even the darkest forces cannot entirely overcome. The entity had failed to destroy them that night, but had taught them a permanent truth. Darkness is patient, fear is persistent, and life, fragile, terrifying, fleeting, is worth defending at every turn.